What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king. In today's episode, I do decree that the trajectory of the Super Mario franchise over the last decade has been one of the most underrated modern tragedies in video gaming. And obviously that title sounds very dramatic, and I don't want to come across as though I think that the last few Super Mario games have been bad games. Absolutely not. They just haven't been as appealing to me as the Super Mario titles that released between 1996 and 2007. Let me explain. First of all, it is well understood that there are three different types of Super Mario titles. The first of them, and the most common and the oldest, obviously being the platformer. Just the straight up, pure to form platformer. Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, 3, Super Mario World, the new Super Mario Bros. Games. You can even argue to an extent that games like Super Mario Land, or 3D Land, and Super Mario 3D World also fall into this category. But for the most part, I want to stick with the original games all the way up to through the SNES, Super Mario Land on the Game Boy and all that, and then the new Super Mario Bros. Games. Then we have the collectathons. Now, there aren't quite as many in this category, but I would mostly just classify Super Mario Galaxy 2, Super Mario 3D World, and Super Mario Odyssey in this category. These are games that are definitely a lot less concerned with giving you a singular objective to focus on at any one time, and are more concerned with giving you a lot of different things to do at any given time. Now, don't get me wrong, Super Mario 3D World and Galaxy 2 in particular do have streamlined missions in which they want you to go through, but they also do try to encourage you to get a lot of extraneous things. Like in Super Mario Galaxy 2, it was the green stars, and in Super Mario 3D World, it's just a lot of coin collecting. Like, they really hammer that home, as was carried over from the likes of Super Mario 3D Land and the new Super Mario Bros. Series, particularly 2. And then, of course, Super Mario Odyssey just has a crap ton of moons for you to collect, as well as other things to unlock outfits and the like, and is definitely focused on peppering all sorts of things for the player to find and explore and discover as they play throughout the world. And then, of course, we have the third type of Mario game, and that is the adventure game, which I think really boils down to Super Mario 64, Super Mario Sunshine, and Super Mario Galaxy. No surprise, all three of those games are my favorite Mario titles to this day. I like their format the most. They carried over what I thought were the most endearing qualities of mascot platformers from the 5th and 6th generation of consoles. So 5th generation being like N64, PS1, and Sega Dreamcast, and then 6th generation being PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. Specifically games like the Banjo-Kazooie series, Sly Cooper, etc. I mean, you can make the argument that these games in turn also took inspiration from Super Mario 64 itself, but that baseline, that standard, that idea of what a mascot, a 3D platformer is supposed to be, where you have these singular focused objectives, and the primary focus of the game is very simple. Give you a character, understand their abilities and how they work, and then give you worlds in which to traverse through with that character and their special abilities in new and unique ways as you progress throughout the game. A very simple concept at its core, but it actually works really well in building up two incredibly important aspects of what I think make a good 3D platformer. The first of them is skill mastery. Most of these games from the get-go give you every single tool that you need to succeed right at the start, and from there, you either slowly uncover these tools as you go, or if you already know the tools, you use them better and better the more you play to eventually blast your way through things with either minimal or no effort as you go. The other thing that this does is it severely strengthens the worlds that you're playing in. Most of these kinds of games give you locations that you're going to get very well acquainted with after spending copious amounts of time in them. This is not something that either of the other two genres of Mario games do very well. While yes, the skill mastery is still there, it's the world building and the understanding and the learning of the different places that you're in that I think both the platformer and the collectathon aspect of a Mario game sort of fall flat. In my humble opinion, and I know this is probably going to be a little bit of a controversial one, but the absolute weakest part of Super Mario Odyssey is its level design. Outside of one level, and we all know which level it is, outside of one level, Super Mario Odyssey does not offer very compelling locations for the player to play around in. A lot of them fall flat in different ways, whether they end up very directionless and aimless and just kind of hope that the player discovers things to do for themselves, or they might look bland and uninteresting, or they are just tedious and confusing. Take your pick. Meanwhile, the likes of Super Mario 3D World, the likes of the new Super Mario Bros. Games, and all these other games out there encourage you to blast through levels so quickly that you really don't have the time to stop and smell the roses. This is my biggest criticism of Super Mario Galaxy 2 versus Super Mario Galaxy 1. Now, don't get me wrong, Super Mario Galaxy 1 does have a fair amount of locations that you will only ever visit once. You don't spend a lot of time in them, and that's fine. Most of those levels serve as extraneous bonus challenges. They are not supposed to be the main worlds that you learn to explore. It's the more involved worlds, the worlds with several objectives in them, that evolve and change and show you new and different things, but also play with a lot of the same mechanics that you have to use in different and unique ways. While Super Mario Galaxy 2 has levels like that, they're much farther and fewer between. Galaxy 2 tries to sell you on the fact that there's a lot more to do, quote unquote, by having a lot more levels peppered throughout the game. I've always kind of criticized Galaxy 2 as feeling like a map pack, like a giant modded map extension of Galaxy 1, where you just do a level here and there and have a new objective every single time, and you never really get a chance to stop and breathe for a second. You're always being thrown new things at every single turn, and while that can be exciting and that can be fun, it just doesn't have the same effect that a game like Galaxy 1 has, or Sunshine has, or 64 has. The strength of Super Mario 64 was each and every individual level and learning how they worked. That game had a very natural, and I want to put the word natural in quotes, natural progression of difficulty as you went throughout the game. Now, I say natural in quotes because, well, yes, it is definitely true that the levels get progressively harder as you go. It's more so the curve, the slope of that difficulty curve that can be criticized as you go, because sometimes it would drop off a cliff and other times it would plateau for a couple of levels. So there's definitely criticisms to be made there. I don't think Mario 64 is the most perfect example, but it's still a pretty good one. Meanwhile, Super Mario Sunshine hits you with a very consistent idea of how the game is supposed to work from start to finish. A very consistent aesthetic, and granted, it can be a turnoff if you are not a fan of the tropical, bright, sunny style that Mario Sunshine is supposed to convey, but that progression is still relatively natural, and it still gives you an idea of what you're going to experience from start to finish. And, not to mention, gets you incredibly well acquainted with the levels while still changing things up enough within those very same levels as you go. But all these points are very subjective, obviously. I mean, I'm not going to try to say that one idea is better than the other. Platformers just personally aren't as much my cup of tea unless they have something very unique that grabs onto me. Like, honestly, you're just not going to find me playing Shovel Knight anytime soon. Not saying it's a bad game. It's actually a fantastic game. Phenomenal game, even. It's just not my cup of tea. You're much more likely going to find me playing something like Banjo-Tooie, yes, the original N64 version, yes, with all of its flaws, than you will find me playing a game like Shovel Knight, because I like games that I can feel right at home in, and this is kind of what leads me into my very last point, and my honestly biggest criticism with the more modern Mario games. And again, everyone who's watching this, we can agree to disagree if you don't feel this way, but I feel like there has been a huge sense of identity lost since Super Mario Galaxy, because while Super Mario Odyssey, Super Mario 3D World, Super Mario 3D Land, the new Super Mario Bros. Games, while all those games are fine, none of them really have a very strong identity to me. I think Mario Odyssey does, but its identity is only, I think, in its movement system. In the way that you can actually control Mario, that was very unique and different. That is pretty much the only thing that, when I think of Super Mario Odyssey, and I think of how that stands out from any other 3D platformer I've ever played, that's really the one core element. It's nothing else. It's not its world design, it's not its look, it's not its feel, it's not the way that the story goes, it's none of that stuff. Nothing else stands out to me except for that exceptional and very high skill gap movement system that the game has. When I look at Mario 3D World and all the new Super Mario Bros. Games and Mario 3D Land, I mean, those games just kind of all blend together as just one game, personally, just some looking slightly prettier than the others. I mean, they feel like they all kind of have the same objective, they kind of borrow the same ideas from one another, they kind of use the same level aesthetic for each one. Mario Galaxy 1 and Super Mario Sunshine and Mario 64 feel very personal, very special. There is something incredibly magical and totally unreplicatable from Super Mario 64 with the feeling of going through that castle, jumping into a painting, and going through each of the worlds and just experiencing them for how they are. I mean, Bob-omb Battlefield is such a simple level, but it is so uniquely its own. There really is nothing like it. I mean, anybody can glance at Bob-omb Battlefield and just immediately recognize it for what it is. I mean, and that doesn't just apply to that level. That applies to a lot of levels. I mean, I would say more specifically a lot of the earlier game levels in Mario 64, but there are so many of them that are just so uniquely their own that, you know, there's no copycats out there. I mean, if there are, they're probably done very poorly, but you could never successfully try to even remotely copy that without getting caught. Super Mario Sunshine, as a whole, again, very uniquely its own. There's really nothing out there that kind of has that same bright and sunny style, except I would say the one exception being like A Hat in Time, but even that has its own totally unique style to it that it's still so far removed from Super Mario Sunshine outside of its color palette. Super Mario Sunshine is bright, it's colorful, it has that tropical aesthetic nailed down, that again, no other 3D platformer is anything like it in that regard, and its movement system with FLUDD, I mean, to this day, just it's never been replicated properly, or if anyone's even tried, no one's ever come even close to that. And then there's Super Mario Galaxy, which I'm gonna be honest is the game that prompted the discussion of this entire video. I've already talked about it a little bit, but Super Mario Galaxy, out of every single Mario game to this day, has, in my opinion, the most personal, unique, interesting, and enrapturing aesthetic and story and presentation of any Mario game yet. It's not just the way that the game looks, it's not just the visuals, it's the feeling you get while playing that game, and nothing since has even come close to replicating it, in my opinion. Now, I'm not saying it's some masterpiece of storytelling, absolutely not. The story is, in fact, incredibly simple. Really, the only meaty piece of story is the stuff that you experience within the library that you will unlock throughout the game, but even that's more lore than it is actually story. It's more to do, again, with the overall presentation, the music, the audio and sound effects, the visual style that everything has, how it manages to be so bright and colorful, yet so decidedly melancholy at the same time. And that's another thing that separates it from Galaxy 2. Galaxy 2 does not have that feeling of melancholy the entire time you play it. It is very much just happy, bright, and colorful. Galaxy somehow managed to nail down a sense of sadness that is, in my opinion, very healthy, actually. It's not in any way depressing. It's very sobering, I guess is the word that I would use. There is a video that I actually recently saw that's on this topic that I would highly recommend you go check out. I believe his name is Jacob Geller. He's had a few videos on YouTube that have recently gone sort of viral over the last year. He does some interesting analysis videos and stuff like that. I've seen a few of his videos, but he did one on that's called The Quiet Sadness of Mario Galaxy. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. And go watch that, and you'll probably understand where I'm coming from with Mario Galaxy if you've never played it. If you have played it, you probably understand what I'm talking about, because, like I said, the Galaxy sort of evokes this mood that is entirely and uniquely its own. But again, so does Sunshine, and so does Mario 64. And I really don't think that the rest of the Mario games manage that. Odyssey does in very, very small bits and pieces. There are certainly moments where it does, but the game as a whole just doesn't feel like one cohesive experience, in my opinion. At least not one cohesive emotional experience. It just feels like one cohesive gameplay experience, which is fine, and that's good. And again, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but I feel like we've lost something since Super Mario Galaxy when it comes to those very personal, those very uniquely their own Mario games that we had with those three in particular, with Mario 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy, where they stand on their own not just as games, but as experiences, as places of solace, which is such a weird thing to say, but that's something that's incredibly important to me when it comes to video games. Games that are not only good, but you can take comfort in them. It's something very rare and very special. And Nintendo had it down pat for about a decade, and since then it feels like they just don't want to do that anymore. Now, granted, I sort of understand why. It's long been said that between 64, Sunshine, and Galaxy, they were overall, I mean, for what it's worth, no Mario game really performs poorly, but comparably, they're some of the worst performing Mario games, as opposed to a lot of the games that came after. I mean, Galaxy did really well, but comparatively to how Mario games usually do on a Nintendo system, it actually did very poorly. Sunshine and 64 were both on sort of underperforming systems as well. And Galaxy 2, I believe, outdid the first Mario Galaxy. I think at least it did in terms of like a certain span of time or something like that. I don't know. And then the 3D Land games and 3D World games and the new Super Mario Bros. Games have been massive successes. In fact, I'm pretty sure New Super Mario Bros. Wii totally outperformed Super Mario Galaxy. And yeah, Nintendo moving away from that for that reason totally makes sense, and I honestly can't fault them for it. But I do think that the series has been weaker as a result, and I think the entire industry is poorer as a result, because it felt like those games were the last great holdout from a generation of 3D games that the entire industry decided to label as obsolete, except for they understood what made those games work so well, practically to perfection. And it's sad to see them go, and I really hope that someday Nintendo does end up giving that style of game just one more shot. Just once, please. That's all I want.